what are some of the legal questions that your clients have about reoccupying buildings at this point?
So, it's interesting because in terms of just the employee perspective, their workers' compensation is the exclusive remedy. So the legal considerations for employers on the employees, it still runs through workers' comp, but for more frequenters or visitors, their questions are including, should we have guests sign waivers? And if so, what do those waivers look like? And it's been interesting because when President Trump was setting up, and this is not meant to be political, it's just an anecdote, but when President Trump was setting up his political event in Oklahoma, there were concerns about the guests being asked to sign waivers and whether those would be enforceable or not. And what has come up is that the city of Milwaukee is looking at whether they would have an ordinance which would preclude liability waivers for larger crowds when there's COVID-19 concerns. And U.S. Representative Bill Pocan actually introduced the Rallies Act, which is focused again on larger crowds and attempting to have waivers signed in order to participate above, a certain level, like 1,000 people, when there is, continuing or still high levels of COVID activity. So while waivers may be a good consideration to have, there is this kind of bubble of potential litigation on whether they would be enforceable, because, the question is it fair to ask people to set aside, their rights to, participate in certain activities or not? So that's a tool that's a frequent topic of conversation. The other type of questions that come up are, what generally is my exposure? And the typical type of claims that could come up would be negligence and safe place claims. And so what we've talked to employers and business owners about is, if you do your best to follow the guidance that's available and create, open communication, good signage, and implement reasonable safety measures, that's good insurance on the types of claims that could be brought against you, which are all focused around, did you do enough to try and keep people coming on your site safe from whatever the issue was?
Right. And what do some of those guidelines look like for employers?
You've got a variety of different guidelines. So, you've got the CDC, the WHO, the AIA re-occupancy tool, and a lot of them are they're focused on trying to give reasonable guidance on lower cost measures that people can take to communicate what their individual plan is for the building. And they often, one thing that they suggest is that you use your website and your social media to inform people ahead of time for, your hours of operation, whether you require masks, what the expectations are, so that the customer experience can be a positive one, so people kind of know what they're coming into. So that's as much of a business relationship issue as anything else. And then, trying to maintain that social distancing, which is easier to do in some situations than others. In a small storefront, I took my kids out to a farmer's market in Wauwatosa this week, and they did a great job of spreading out the different tents for what was available, but in limiting the crowd and still encouraging face masks. So it kind of depends on the setup of your building in terms of what you're able to implement, but the guidance is pretty uniform in terms of trying to maintain social distancing, recommending masks within a interior space, and then having, hand sanitizing stations and other notices when possible.
Okay. And you mentioned that AIA re-occupancy tool, which I know you introduced to Law Journal readers and readers of our sister publication, The Daily Reporter, and it was very, very popular on both websites. So could you kind of give us an overview of that tool and talk about anything that may have changed to it in the past since it's come out?
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. So in early May, the AIA came out with what they called a re-occupancy tool, and it came out of their disaster assistance committee, that was a combination of health experts, design professionals, construction professionals, public safety officials, and facility managers. So what attracted me to that as someone who deals a lot in construction was that, that's a pretty thoughtful group that are focused more on kind of the building structure, the building envelope, and the building operation. So there's been a lot of guidance from the CDC and WHO just generally focused on the health and well-being of individuals. But the AIA reoccupancy tool came at it from a slightly different perspective with all these smart people who know how the building was designed, they know how it was intended to be operated. So what this group did, they took the CDC's hierarchy of controls, which is a fancy way of saying that the CDC a long time ago came out with, there's 5 of them, and the hierarchy of controls is just identifying what things could be done to implement feasible and effective control solutions to occupational hazards that might face in employees or other people who are in a given space. So it wasn't COVID-19 focused, but that framework applied to COVID-19. So what the AIA group did was they said, all right, so the first 2 controls, and it goes from most effective to least effective. Most effective is elimination. And here, you can't eliminate the threat of COVID-19 when you're talking about reoccupying a building. The best way to eliminate the threat is social isolation, which cuts against reoccupying buildings where you're bringing people together to work in that environment. So that didn't really work. The next one, which is second most effective, is substitution. Well, there isn't a substitution for COVID-19, thankfully. We've got our hands full with that. We're not looking to substitute another pandemic issue. So they said, all right, we're not going to focus on those 2. The 3, less effective, but still options are engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. So an example of engineering controls would be ventilation and physical barriers, focusing more on kind of the physical space setup. For administrative controls, those were more policy considerations, whether you have work from home or you're staggering schedules, and then some, sanitation guidelines using hand sanitizer, things like that. And then the last one is PPE, which pretty much everybody, including, I've got 4 young kids and they know what PPE is because we have them wear masks when we go into different spaces. So those are the 3 controls that the AIA focused on. And what they did, which I thought was nice, was they didn't say do this or don't do that. They recognized that there is a cost continuum for people to consider, and that there's certain things that may be feasible or not, depending on the certain circumstance that a business was in. And they also broke it out between essential and non-essential businesses. So they really tried to, in early May, give this guidance and say, we're not going to tell you what you have to do because every situation is individualized, but here are some good considerations that you should take into account, whether you're the owner of the building, whether you're the tenant, whether you're the facilities manager, and all of you working together to figure out how can you implement a framework to allow for either the essential businesses to continue operating in as safe of a manner as possible, or, for example, for my law firm, where we sent everybody home in mid-March and have started a process of bringing people back, the AIA tool gives some really good considerations about how do you work in that built-in environment with different controls to start bringing people back into the space.
Okay. Could you talk a little more about how your law firm has implemented some of these recommendations and what that looks like for you working in the building?
Yeah, so we're in an interesting spot because we are, currently a tenant in a building where we're working on moving back into, but we're also in the process of constructing a new space in the Huron building that we're going to be moving to in October. And so at the same time, we're focused on bringing our workforce back into our existing space. We've got other considerations for design and construction at play for a new space in October. So I'll speak to the kind of the first one first, and then maybe we can touch on the new building later. But in terms of moving back into our existing space, even though we were an essential business under Governor Evers' initial order and allowed to continue operating, we made the decision firm-wide across all 18 of our offices throughout the US to have everyone work from home other than, you know, a skeleton group of accounting and some other functions, you know, computer services who needed to be physically in the building. So starting in mid-March, we were all working from home. And thankfully, technology is such that you can still be productive in your home environment if you can tolerate your dogs barking and the kids knocking and all of that. But since then, starting in May, depending on the geography, so, you know, Omaha is in a different position than Milwaukee is in terms of the issues and readiness and everything else. So we individualized our return to work for our given office, which is, I make that point because with a lot of our clients with locations in places outside of Wisconsin, we've had to kind of personalize the approach. It can't just be what works here, works everywhere else. But for Milwaukee, we started a phase 1 return to work in May. And the focus there was on a combination of people who felt comfortable with returning to the office, people who felt like they needed to get into the office on a part-time basis. And I was in that camp with 4 young kids at home. I wanted to be in periodically, just, you know, kind of a mental break, if nothing else, but also access to a, you know, higher volume printer and things like that. And then the third component was the first group who were coming back had to be comfortable with following the guidance that we had set in place in terms of what to do when you were in the building. So everyone had to be comfortable with wearing a mask when they weren't in their specific individual office, recording, you know, temperature before they left, and recording any close interactions within the space. So we really left it up to who's comfortable to come back. Are you willing to follow the guidance that's in place? And do you really have a need to be back? So phase 1 was about 10% of our workforce coming back on a rolling basis where we staggered the schedule. And it's interesting, you know, first day back for me in May, it was a very light parking lot. You know, the drive was pretty easy to get into work. Not hard to find a parking spot. You know, got to the elevator, and we have 4 elevators for our 19 floors. And, you know, you're supposed to only have 2 people in the elevator at a time. So, you know, right from the get-go and from coming from your car into the elevator and getting up to the building, you could see all the different social distancing guidelines and controls they've put into place. And then, you know, went into my office. And once I was in my physical space, it was business as usual, but very different to come in with a limited number of people and the building focused measures that were put into place, as well as our own firm measures. So since then, we've moved to phase 2, which is really the same as phase 1 in terms of the protocols. We're just increasing the capacity. So we're now probably at around 25% of our workforce, which has come back into the office on a rolling basis. And our goal is, you know, hopefully later this month to get to phase 3, which is a 50% capacity coming back, but still, you know, not pushing anyone who's not comfortable coming back to do so. Anyone who's got any sort of, you know, physical concerns, whether they've got, you know, lower immune system or asthma or anything else. So it's a very much a match of trying to stay in a rhythm of productivity and comfort while abiding by the you know, protections that we've put in place in the building. And what we've done is similar to what we're advising our clients to do, which is to be, in addition to the legal considerations, very much being in tune with the comfort level of your employees and having them be involved in coming up with some of, you know, the ways in which we communicate, and to some extent the ways in which we have implemented some of our measures. You know, we've had focus groups and other people at our offices give feedback in terms of what they thought would be effective, what they thought they were comfortable with. And within reason, we've really tried to incorporate those into what we do. So I found that if you have a good channel of communication with your employees and with your customers, then that you still want to be protected on the legal considerations, but that's kind of the first focus that hopefully will lessen any issues at a later date.
Right. And for your clients, is there considering how comfortable employees feel and also these recommendations? How many of them are going, because it sounds like there's quite a spectrum of things they can do in terms of really investing a lot into ventilation and things like that versus the kind of other end of just PPE. So how many of them where do most of them fall on that spectrum?
No, that's a great question. And so one of the things that we did, which I thought was interesting, so in late April, early May, we sent out a survey to clients and contacts throughout the US, and we got feedback from around 30 states and some provinces in Canada. And the questions were along the lines of what you just asked. What have you started to implement? What concerns do you have short-term and long-term relative to your office environment and your employees? And overwhelmingly, the two answers that we got in terms of the most significant legal concerns were liability tied to on-site premises infections and employee customer safety. So then the survey further broke down into, all right, so on the safety side, what types of measures are you looking at as business owners to implement? And the two categories were measures that could be taken quickly, unilaterally, and relatively inexpensively. So, think about cleaning protocols and modifying, the physical workspace, maybe, removing some chairs or tables in the kitchen. Or creating some additional separation between workspaces, changing, staggering schedules, and just having signage to promote social distancing. So that's kind of the first category. Then the second category were things that required a greater capital expense. So just, a cash outlay to modify a physical space, or more of a legal analysis or a buy-in. So think, contact tracing technology, or regular testing regimens, or actually, building permanent physical partitions in space, or changing your kitchen to something else. So for the first category, the respondents had already implemented a variety of those measures and felt very comfortable doing that. The second category, there was trepidation for a lot of reasons to make those investments that might hit the bottom line financially, that might strike the wrong chord with employees who probably recognize at some level the need to communicate certain information that traditionally you wouldn't have. For example, many employers don't want to make taking temperature a battlefront issue. They don't intend to do anything with that information, but they also want to try and, where they can, with data points, try to be smart about whether someone should be asked to stay home to, confirm that they're not sick. So in that second category of higher cost expenses or potential hot button topics with employees, there's been very much a wait and see attitude towards those. To try and get through, the initial kind of phase one of the return and decide, should we be making structural changes to our physical space long term to account for this, or should we be, retrofitting in a more modest way with a hope that there will be a vaccine within the next 6 months. So at least now, it's that second category where we're having a lot of conversations about timing and, should we implement any of those things, versus that first category where I think people are very comfortable moving forward with those.
Right. And have your construction clients seen an increase in people who are asking for these types of physical changes, or if they're on a site of new construction, are plans changing to accommodate some of these recommendations?
So yeah, I've got, a couple interesting things that I can point out here. One for our building that I mentioned earlier, which the building itself, Josh Jeffers is doing and started construction sometime last spring, I believe. So that construction's been ongoing, and then we've got the physical build out of our space, and we're working with CG Schmidt as a general contractor and Nelson as our architect. And we were already going to, have individual offices for all of our timekeepers, attorneys, and paralegals. So that right there built in some kind of social distancing to allow for them to come back. So we already had that as part of our general plan. But, in trending with, a lot of keeping up with millennial workers who are interested in co-working space and not necessarily being in their physical environment, office environment the whole time, we've got what we call the loungebrary, which is a combination of library and, Starbucks. And we've got a big open space for our cafeteria, which can be a multi-use event space. So those two spaces in particular, we had a lot of excitement from particularly our younger lawyers about those spots, but short term, our management is saying, well, those are the places that are kind of most at risk in terms of coming back. So we have still kept those spaces in our plans, but as we look towards moving in, if we're kind of where we are now in October, the plan is to, reduce the amount of furniture in those spaces and try and contain, more smaller subsets of those spaces where you could still have a breakout area, but not have that closer connection. So it's this interesting tug of, do you make design decisions in particular with this shorter term focus, or still kind of maintain this, longer time horizon? So we didn't make changes there, but we have made some changes to the HVAC system and certain other building controls to account for, some of the guidance that the CDC and the AIA tool has put out there. So that's been interesting. Then the construction projects themselves, I have not seen a lot of kind of larger investment projects that owners have asked construction companies to come in and modify a physical building space. So it's been more of the smaller variety projects where you may be implementing partitions or doing, things that are intended to be temporary solutions to help tenants ease back into a comfort level in their space. I have seen, though, in, one example would be the temporary hospital that was constructed at State Fair Park in Milwaukee. So, that is intended to be an overflow if local hospitals were at capacity for critical care units. So that's an example of a project that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Gilbane worked on to, prepare that space for an overflow needs. And so that was an example where, yes, a bigger investment was made into that space. The other example that I can think of is Bolt Construction and HGA Architects came up with, they call it the STAT mod. So it's short for Strategic Temporary Acute Adaptable Treatment, which is a mouthful. But the gist of it is they saw, as news was coming out this spring, that the ICU capacity was being stretched. So they got together and came up with a modular critical care healthcare building that you can transport on site to existing hospitals, and it's a standalone critical care unit, or you could put it in a convention center or somewhere else. So they came up with this product, and it was fascinating in talking with Ben Bruns from Bolt and Kurt Spearing from HGA about this, because they had to come up with this product from scratch in a COVID-19 environment where you weren't able to actually physically get together with the architects, the engineers, the general contractors, and other trades and suppliers. They had to do that virtually and figure this out. Kurt Spearing talked about how they incorporated a lot more virtual reality in terms of getting feedback from healthcare professionals who would actually use the product. And he said that was fantastic because real time they would have a nurse going through their proposed design and saying, you know, actually you should put the sink over here because when I'm facing a patient, I want to turn this way. And so through virtual reality, they could just move things around real time based on that input from the end user. And it accelerated a design process that normally would have taken, you know, 6 to 8 months into a matter of weeks. And then they used the design, that type of design process blended with modular construction, where they were working with available materials because of, you know, concerns with sourcing items in a COVID environment, and building that in a prefabricated way so they could ship the units to whatever location that they were going to end up with. So, you know, the first units were being sent to a hospital in Maryland to be put online there. So, you know, really interesting example there of the pandemic forcing creativity, you know, utilizing it. Probably advanced, I think the pandemic accelerated the construction industry's adoption of technology by, you know, some multiple of you know, X times whatever, and just sped up a lot of things that construction companies were starting to do. And I think that even when we're outside of this pandemic, you will see design firms and construction firms utilize some of what they're doing now because they have to, because it's more efficient and you're able to you know, do things like I gave the example on the VR. So really interesting stuff.
Yeah, definitely. In addition to the VR that people are using more, what are some of the other things that you see as sticking around after the pandemic ends in the construction industry?
So the VR for sure, I think incorporating that more in projects. I think that modular construction will continue to see that increase. You know, it deals with, it takes into account a lot of different issues. You know, there are challenges with the labor force. And so that helps to deal with the volume of laborers that are available. Modular construction helps on the safety side because you don't have people going on site, climbing up to dangerous areas. You're working in a factory setting in a controlled environment, so you don't have the height hazards that are working there as well. And it's just a more efficient way to get people rolling through. So one of the harder things for construction companies right now is the changes that COVID has caused to their typical schedule, where they're looking to be very efficient, oftentimes having multiple trades work in the same space. And right now you can't do that as much because of social distancing. You know, you have to stagger the workforce and the work trades and everything else. And modular construction can allow you to bring in some of the efficiencies with having multiple trades work at the same time, but also build in some of that social distancing, because you can have, you know, kind of one crew follow the other as you go through in almost like in assembly line fashion on different components. So that's something I think that sticks around. Another aspect that I think will start with designers and work through construction is the well building standards. So LEED has been around for a long time. Well building is something that the U.S. Green Building Council put out there. And I think we will see more owners and designers focusing on aspects of well building in the new designs because of the need to consider, you know, the employee health and well-being, and, you know, how are you going to, I guess, energize a workforce that some of which has been quite comfortable working at home to come back into the Reoccupy buildings. So I would not be surprised at all to see an acceleration of well building, and not necessarily even because people are trying to get the certification, but just because those concepts of, you know, health and safety and mindfulness and bringing in different elements, it would not surprise me if that kind of naturally just works its way into the process. And as an extension, if people are doing it anyway, they may seek that certification as a byproduct.
Okay. I spoke with two people who were somewhat of ambassadors for well building right before the pandemic, and they said there were some interesting differences between things that Well Building recommended and that LEED certification would require. And some of those things talked about like using paper towels versus the hand dryers. And then when you think about that in context of the pandemic, what are there a lot of differences there? Do you know about how or what things might be affected or might have to change?
So you gave the perfect example, and I can relate to it having young kids. And when you've got the hand dryer and the towels, my kids go for the hand dryer all the time because it's louder and air blows out. But the science shows that that's just kind of recirculating the germs. So I do think that you will see a shift towards what I don't think that people are going to set aside goals of sustainability and kind of the green aspects of things at all. I think that's still going to be an important criteria, but I think the first kind of line of consideration will be the health and safety of the employees or the building occupants generally. And so using that example, paper towels are a safer option. So I don't necessarily think that there will be this battle between LEED or WELL certifications, but I think that you could end up seeing thoughtful designers and owners saying, I don't necessarily care about the certifications that come from either one of those, but let's pull the really good ideas from LEED, the really good ideas from WELL building that are aligned with the CDC and the AIA guidance to help have a safe environment with the type of amenities that people will want to come in for. Because again, it's a bit like the advancement of televisions and how you can create this in-home theater environment. There's a question of, well, when do you still go to the movies then? Because you've got you've got the availability of this great setup at home. I think there's going to be a little bit of that with the building environments, that there's still a huge value and need for physical office space. But people need to be thoughtful on, what really is drawing people into those spaces that they can't get at home or a supplement for at home. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations around what criteria to either update existing spaces or for new spaces. And I think for a while you may see a platypus of pulling good things from these different organizations who, they all add a ton of value, and coming up with what makes sense for an individual owner or building occupants. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of this, because I think the only thing I can say for sure is that it's going to be different than the way we've done it before.
Definitely. And in our last couple minutes here, I know this week a really hot topic is Milwaukee's mask ordinance that's set to go in effect on Thursday. And how do you see that impacting reoccupying buildings?
Going back to what I talked about earlier, and I don't think that we're unique in our approach, and in particular in talking with other clients. So at least in the early stages of reoccupying, where we're not trying to get to 100%, I don't think a mask ordinance will alter kind of the process at this point, because coming back to the physical space for most companies that aren't at 100% already is somewhat of a voluntary exercise. And if people aren't comfortable with following whatever the protocols are, there's a respectful way to say, well, look, you're not ready to come back yet, and that's totally okay. So I think a mask ordinance for now likely isn't as controversial for most employers, because they're focused on bringing back those people who are comfortable with following whatever the guidance is. What would be interesting is when we start seeing more businesses get towards phase 3 or phase 4, where they're approaching 100% occupancy, and you may be bringing back more people who aren't as comfortable with being in the space, or feel like wearing a mask is more of a political statement than it is intended to be, kind of a protective measure. And at that point, it will be challenging for employers, and we will continue to have those conversations with employers about, can we take action relative to employees who refuse to follow the guidance that we set. And in general terms, employers do have the ability to set policies and have an expectation that their employees follow them. So I think we're right now probably avoiding some of those more difficult conversations just because of where we're at in terms of the percentage of reoccupying. But those conversations, I think, will be inevitable, because I don't, as someone, as a parent with 4 kids who's really hoping that we have in-person school in the fall, I think that there's going to have to be protective measures put in place to allow for those things to happen. And, it's clear that there's different views as to whether those are appropriate or not. And so, yeah, we will be having those conversations more in the fall and the winter. But at least right now, I think that it's not as big of an issue.
Okay, makes sense. And was there anything else you wanted to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
No, I just, really appreciate the opportunity. This is, these are challenging times, regardless of whether you're a building owner, whether you're a construction company or a tenant, trying to figure out in a thoughtful way what to do. And, there are really good resources available. I've talked about some today. We've got another one that our law firms put together, which is a policy toolkit. And what that does, it, allows you to input specific information to your business and your considerations and work with, things we already know that are somewhat uniform and create a policy that's intended to work for you. So I bring that up because there is no one size fits all solution. The same type of business here in Milwaukee could have a very different set of considerations than a business in Texas.
Right.
And so, especially with clients who do business in different places, what we routinely tell them is there's a lot of information that's out there. Try to be thoughtful with it. Try to set up things where you're getting input from employees, that you're being good at communicating to your employees, to your customers about what's going on and why you're doing it. But understand that there are a lot of variables, and you're just gonna have to be flexible, because who knew 3 weeks ago that we would have a mask ordinance in the city of Milwaukee?
Right.
And there's going to be a lot of other things that come up, which will be like that, where you just have to adjust on the fly. And, as long as you have a good base where you've got kind of a thoughtful toolkit already, you should be able to handle these other things that come up. But, it's an interesting time, and I'm sure that, there will be a lot more conversations like this one over the course of the next month as we continue to learn more about best practices and continue to face the challenges and obstacles that are presented in front of us.